Thank you. Accelerate the vision. As you can imagine, the word accelerate is much used in my business. Vision, not so much. Only used by the bigger, more successful teams, because they truly have a vision. But the most important aspect of vision is the execution afterwards. And that's what the most successful teams in my business are very good at doing. Now, I don't pretend to know all the details of how you operate your business, but I'm going to use my 60 minutes this morning to give you a feel for how they operate in my business. Motor racing, Formula One, and the Indy 500 at the highest levels on a global platform. And it's a sport that challenges people and pushes them to what might be possible. And on good days, it's an education, and on bad days, it's an even bigger education at times. So I want to give you a little bit of a feel, a little bit below the surface of how this great business operates. Now, if I talk a little funny, I am from a place called Ireland. Has anyone here ever heard of Ireland? Sounds like you were a bit Irish last night. Anybody drunk last night? But if ever you go to Ireland, which is a long way from here, and all my family are still there, by the way, but if ever you go there, you'll find they're a very friendly group of people. They love to get together and have a chat. They love to go out and have a drink at night. They love to have another drink in the morning. They would seldom miss lunchtime. You know, if ever you go to a pub in Ireland, they'll tell you you're not really drunk, as long as you can still lie on the floor without holding on. So if you think about that environment, it was a bit of an unusual environment for me to go to my dad when I was 12 years of age and say, I want to become a professional race car driver. My dad sold vegetables at a corner grocery store. We had a grass patch outside our house, and the kids played soccer. That was it. That's all you did. My dad took great pride in telling the neighbors that I came from a privileged upbringing. He said if I wanted to do anything out of the ordinary, I had the privilege of finding a way to do it all by myself. And actually, I was okay with that. But I truly had no idea the trek I was about to go on. So let me take you back a little bit first. You know that I was a professional race car driver, and you probably have an idea what a racing car looks like. Well, have a look at this here, because this is my very first racing car. Now, wouldn't you be proud of your son? If he arrived home and says, Dad, I just bought my very first race car. I want you to tow it on the end of a rope down through the neighborhood, put it behind the house in the garage, because that's where I'm going to work on it. That was it back in 1969 when I was 16 in Ireland. And believe it or not, at 16, I was the youngest ever to start racing in Ireland. Nowadays, you're 10 years behind times, because it happens so much faster nowadays. Kids are racing go-karts at 5 and 6 years of age because things just happen so much faster. But I actually went all the way from this classic picture here to the World Championship in Formula One. And my first year was 1978. My first year was the year Mario Andretti became world champion. Mario was such a legend. He'd won Daytona, he won the Indy 500, then he came to race with us in Formula One. So as part of this magical time in Formula One. The blue car here is me going around the hairpin at Monaco. It's exactly the same hairpin today. They use the very same track. The white car that you see here, that's the last team that I drove for, Williams. They're still active today. Do you know back then we spent $25 million running these two cars in the World Championship? And you know back then people said, it'll never last. Formula One will never generate that amount of commercial sponsorship year in, year out to spend that amount of money on race cars. Today, to run at that level, and this team is still active, it's $250 million. And it's never been bigger. Formula One today is the largest watched sport in the world. Major corporations use it to make a statement about their designers, their engineers, their manufacturing, everything about their product against their showroom competitors. They want to prove on a global stage in competition they are the best. And that is what has made Formula One so incredibly big, obviously because of television. Now, lap speeds, when I was in Formula One, we were doing lap speeds on average of 150 miles an hour. A lot faster than when I started. And then I went to a place called Indianapolis. There was a magical race called the Indy 500. And I went there in 1983, and quite honestly, I went just for curiosity to see what it was all about. And I realized in a place like Indy, they do 200 miles an hour. And what was even more unusual about that, they did it between two concrete walls. And for a European road racer, that was very different. But 200 miles an hour, things are getting really fast. And you know, when I actually got there, I couldn't do 200 miles an hour. By the way, has anybody here, hands up, ever driven at 200 miles an hour? Intentionally? Just to give you an idea what speed that is, at 200 miles an hour, you actually cover the full length of a football field every second. And do you know today, I still do television at Indy. Today, it's not even considered fast. You wouldn't even be allowed past your rookie test today at Indy if you can only do 200 miles an hour, because things have got so much faster these days. When I do my television interviews after qualifying at Indy, the straight line speed coming on the long straight at the front of Indy, straight line speed is 235 miles an hour. Now at that speed, you cover 350 feet every second. An average human being only takes 1/7 of a second just to blink his eye. So think about it. When a driver's qualifying at Indy, if he dares to blink, he misses 50 feet of the racetrack right there. If you dare to blink your eye. Isn't that incredible? These things are just literally projectiles that fly along the ground. And as you can imagine, at that level, at that speed, things could go wrong. And the most amazing thing about the sport is that it challenges and pushes people to the outer edge of what might be possible. And if things go wrong, it becomes an incredible educational exercise to understand how to make it bigger, better, safer, and maybe even faster, because they know the speed will probably increase. Well, in 1984, it went wrong for me in a race in Michigan above 200 miles an hour. And have a look at these pictures here, because this is a 217-mile-an-hour impact against a concrete wall. And you see from the mangled wreckage here, I'm in the middle of that mangled wreckage. This was the hardest crash impact a driver had ever survived. Now, have a look at these pictures, because the accident at this stage is still doing about 150 miles an hour when I got hit by a second car. And if you look at this picture here, I was about to go back into the wall at 150 miles an hour with the front gone off the car. The safety director said if that had happened, I was about 0.8 of a second from certain fatal injuries. But I got hit by that other car and it spun me down to the inside. And then the accident continued, spins. I came down off the banking down to the inside, and then the head of trauma at the infield trauma care center at the racetrack said, we better fire up the helicopter and get him straight to intensive care. There's no way we can withstand injuries like this or take care of it at the trackside hospital. So I went straight to intensive care to the University of Michigan Hospital. And as you can imagine, after 14 surgeries, you can understand when I tell you this accident changed my life. To give you a bit of a feel for the injuries, I had severe dislocations of my right foot, right ankle, lost all the soft tissue in my heel because I ran along the ground. I had a toe amputated on my left foot in the accident. I had a crushed left ankle. They had to actually do a bone graft from my hip to rebuild my ankle joint with 4 plates and 18 screws. I had a double compound fracture of the left leg. I had a broken hip joint, broken pelvis, broken ribs, broken hand, broken arm, 3rd-degree burns, lacerated liver. Other than that, I think I was actually half decent. But that took care of me as a racing driver for about 2.5 years, because it was 2.5 years before I got back to full-time racing again. And people would ask me, why would you ever go back? And believe it or not, I actually still remember the conversation I had with my dad when I was 12 years of age, when I told him I wanted to become a professional race car driver. And then I realized I would hate to have this accident be the legacy that I left. So I began to formulate, I wonder, could I consider this as an obstacle to be overcome and get back to what I love to do again, which I did. And believe it or not, I won the biggest international races of my career after my accident, after therapy, and after I got back to full-time racing. So, as you can imagine, a certain personal sense of satisfaction to do that. But something really interesting happened while I was in therapy. I fell into television broadcasting. I was asked to do an interview for ESPN that turned into a 10-year contract as a television broadcaster, which turned into another 10-year. I spent 10 years after my career finished in racing as a television broadcaster, but I had a crossover in the middle. And in television, I began to meet some really interesting people. People like Paul Newman. You saw Jay Leno earlier. Spent a lot of time with Stallone. David Letterman comes to every Indy 500. But when I began to hang around with these people, I began to understand that they're very quirky in their nature. I mean, I did a documentary with Stallone after we did the movie, a documentary called The Making of the Movie. And to shoot the documentary, which was a simple interview, he had to bring 4 people with him. He had 2 handlers, he had a manager, and he had a positioning coach. And the positioning coach got active right as I began to ask the first question. She said, "Stop, stop." She came out, lifted his chair, positioned it correctly, sat him back down, and says, "Now you're ready." I'm thinking, how quirky is this bunch of idiots? But then I realized how specific these guys were in their own environment. They controlled it. They were so detailed. And I realized, well, I wonder, are racing drivers anyway like that? And of course, I was doing research for television. I was doing research for things like the Indy 500. And then I realized that when you get on the podium, have you ever seen the podium at Indy or a Formula One race? You know, the victory podium in motor racing is sort of a measurement tool. You know, it's where in Indy they have a historical moment where they drink milk as soon as the great race is over. In Formula One, it's champagne. They shake the champagne. But the victory podium is where the great successful teams go to celebrate. And all the mechanics go, and it's a great time of celebration where you've proved on that day against the competition you were the very best. But when I looked into the success of the great teams of people who work together to become successful, and when I did the research on a race called the Indy 500, I realized the number of people who got to this victory podium was so small. The number of teams who ever got to go there was so small. And I asked a really simple question. Why? Why was the number so small? What was it? What did they do? Did they communicate differently? Did they plan differently? Did they execute differently? Did they have a vision that was unusual? What was it about these people? Were they better under pressure? And of course, I had access to Mario Andretti and Roger Penske and Michael Schumacher and Danny Sullivan. I had access to the biggest, most successful names in the sport. And I began to ask this question, why? And it led me on a trek that became fascinating because it allowed me to see completely under the skin in my sport as to why these small number of teams were successful. And I want to begin to share with you some of the skills and begin to answer that question for you this morning.